Welcome to the Norfolk Sand Dunes podcast. Today we're visiting Holme Dunes in northwest Norfolk. This and our other podcasts have been made possible by the Interreg 2 Seas Endure project, which has received European Development Fund finance, and the Open University's Norfolk Living Dunes project. Today we will join Alex Larter of Norfolk County Council and Gary Hibberd, Holme Dunes Warden for the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, for a walk around the dunes. Wayfinding for Home. This podcast follows a walk from the Norfolk Wildlife Trust Centre at the end of Broadwater Road from the centre. Follow the path through the pine woods and upon reaching the boardwalk, turn left following signs for Seahenge. The walk follows the coast path and you can go all the way to Holme Village and return along Broadwater Road. Or, if you want to return to the beach near the centre, you can do like us and retrace your steps.
We've just left the Holme Norfolk Wildlife Trust Centre, Visitor Centre and Cafe with all the infrastructure for walkers, with the obligatory toilets for the toilet break.
And the dunes are just the other side of this pine clump. Corsican pines, no Scots in here apparently, as far as I know. So these are Corsican pines, originally planted here to stop sand encroaching further inland, back early last century.
So would you say that the pines have stabilised the dunes? What impact has that had on dunes here?
I think very, very little. In as you will see in a little while when we get to the point where we had the storm surge in 2013. It has no bearing on the pine trees at all. You'll see the erosion on the front of the dunes, and you will notice that a good number of the pine trees have dropped off the edge of the dune system. So they certainly haven't helped stabilise it.
No, but has it stopped the dynamics in a way that
yes, I mean
no longer blows?
We're not getting the movement of the sand, the natural movement of the sand over the top. We are in places, but that's usually where the pines have disappeared. These pine trees were flooded in 2013 during the surge tide that happened, and the sea came over the top of the dunes here and flooded this pine valley. Hence, all the Corsican pines inside the dune valley were flooded for 2 weeks with salt water. So all the pine trees sadly died.
Yeah.
Some of the sea buckthorn has survived.
Is that? I've seen. I mean, sea buckthorn is a very resilient plant, isn't it? It grows very quickly, doesn't it? So.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that's some years ago. Obviously, since 7-8 years ago, since the surge tide. So, yeah, at the time, all that remained here was the sea buckthorn on the top of the highest ridge of the dune that you see here on the left-hand side. In the middle there, it was completely bare. All the bramble was dead. All the pines were dead. And what's happened is that the sea buckthorn has grown back into that hollow, obviously since then, in that 8-year period.
Yeah. Okay, so we've arrived at the Norfolk Coast Path, which is part of
the crossroads. Yeah.
Part of the National Trail Network that is maintained by the team at Norfolk County Council that goes through your site.
Yep.
We're going to take it. We're going to take it towards following the sign towards the Seahenge Discovery Site. So we're just accessing the beach through the dunes. As you can see, there's fenced off areas, so please follow the path.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that sort of illustrates the the way the dunes are affected here. Right in front of us, we've got the Zigzag Environment Agency sea defences. They used to run for 400 metres. Only maybe a half or just over a third of these defences survive. The poles that you see, they're like dragon's teeth, so they're triangular, 7 foot long, and they were put in easily 20 years ago. They've been here a long time, and I've got photographs of these posts almost completely buried in sand. So it gives you an idea of the amount of sand that's disappeared. During the surge tide in 2013, that's when we lost the vast amount of the posts. So we lost absolutely loads of this, and this is where we are now, 8 years on. So the erosion has continued gently, I would say, on this front edge of this part of the site. But if you look down the dune system from here, you will see a nice bright green strip of vegetation. This is a sea rocket, prickly saltwort, and frosted orache. These are the strandline species. You can see they're literally growing in the last big high tide that swept up all this seaweed, and basically the vegetation is growing on the nutrients from that. And we do rope this area off because we want these plants coming at their best in July and August, which is usually the time when we've got the largest numbers of people here.
So now we're walking, I believe, westward.
Yep.
Along the Norfolk coast path on the boardwalk, which will take us now through an area of dunes where we've got varied vegetation.
Yeah, so we've got sea buckthorn just here on the right hand side, which is one of the species that we target from a management point of view. Doesn't take too long before that smothers these dune systems.
It's kind of an invasive, isn't it? It takes over all habitats for other plants. It's not. Is it a good shelter for like rabbits or?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the thing. It does have its uses. It does help maintain rabbit populations because that's where they like to breed and shelter and dig the holes. And of course they keep the dunes nice and grazed and short. And the really important thing that rabbits do is they dig the soil up. You know, bare ground is a massively important habitat for so many species, and with nitrification from the atmosphere, you know, we need all the bare ground we can get. You know, that is growing over quicker and quicker.
That's an interesting point actually, because often people think, oh, dunes or bare sand, you know, there's nothing here, it's fine.
Yeah.
Actually, it's probably the opposite sometimes. Bare sand is extremely important.
If I showed you maps of the site just after World War II, there's been a massive reduction in bare ground on the site. And that bare ground is important for a lot of tiny little ephemeral plants. It's also very, very important for invertebrates.
Yeah.
It's really important for bees to sun themselves and heat themselves up. Sand, as you all know, if you've walked on a hot sandy beach, it can get hot.
Yeah.
And that reflection off the sand under the wings to these insects is really, really important for them to warm up.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the species that we've lost or losing slowly, and it's happening all the way along the coast, is the Grayling, which is like a very, in some parts of the country, a very, very common coastal butterfly.
Yeah.
But in our transects over the last 30 years, we have just watched this gradual decline of Grayling, the Grayling butterfly. So, where we're standing at the moment is probably one of the less sort of resilient parts of the site. We're sort of right in the middle here, where behind us we've got all the reclaimed land from the seawall at Thornham. where the bank across to the village there. This was reclaimed back in 1840. So the land behind here isn't working as a salt marsh. It's a freshwater grazing marsh with freshwater reed beds. Some important species are using that.
Moving further along our walk, we come across a part of the reserve that has a rather unique bit of history. Of course, you've heard of Stonehenge, but have you ever heard of Seahenge?
What is Seahenge, Gary? Can you tell us about Seahenge?
Well, it was a circle of stumps that were found, tree stumps that were found on the beach. But so in the late 90s, it was discovered directly out from where we stand now, and it was an archaeologically very, very exciting find, but it had tremendous effect on the site. I mean, we had to manage it very, very carefully. It's a tidal site. It's quite muddy out here as well. But the biggest worry was obviously the influx of people who wanted to come and see it. The tree circle itself was originally capped by peat, and that is why it was protected from all the organisms and the invertebrates that would otherwise gnaw it away gradually. And once the peat broke away on a storm tide, it exposed all the timbers. It was a big thing for the site at the time. We did get some funding from the Norfolk Archaeological Unit, and we were able to warden it.
While you may not have visited the site of Seahenge, many of you listening may be familiar with Holme next to sea as a site for birdwatching. Because of its unique location, Holme can often see some of the rarer passerine visitors.
There's so this area is very important for birds. Shall we come on to a topic of birds?
Yeah, it's a very, very popular site. Spring and autumn is really the time. We're right on the corner of the Wash, so it's one of these places that geographically can drop a lot of migrant birds in the spring. You can see them passing here on a southwesterly wind in the spring. You can stand on these points here and see swallows, swifts, house martins, sand martins, meadow pipits, all moving in sort of large numbers along the edge of the dune system.
We're just going to give ourselves a break in there. And also, if you look towards the beach there's a lot of white spots, so you can see tons of birds.
Yeah.
Although they're not.
They're herring gulls. Just feeding on the receding tide. The visible migration along here is fantastic. But what most people are really interested in are waifs and strays. So they're interested in the rarer migrants that can get dumped here. So after overnight rain in the spring and cloudy conditions, you can find rare birds here. Well, they're rarer now than perhaps they were 30 years ago, but you can find redstarts, pied flycatcher, rarities like wryneck, hoopoo occasionally turns up. Hoopoos occasionally turn up in the spring. And this year seems to have been a very good year for bee eaters. There's been bee eaters along the coast, all really a sign of global warming taking place. And in the background, don't know if you can hear it, we can just hear a meadow pipit. That's can't see it, but there's a distinctive little contact call it does. There it goes again. You should be able to pick it up on the mic. And this is a bird with a nest. This is an anxiety call. There's the bird, it's just gone over the top. And basically, when you're stood nearby a bird like that, it will not go back to the nest until you've gone. So actually standing around or sitting in the wrong place can be quite damaging.
This is a good reminder for us all that while we don't feel our presence may have a big impact on wildlife, sometimes just standing around can have an unseen negative impact. The next step of our walk takes us along the coast path towards Gore Point, which is where the coast path takes a left turn inland.
This to be honest, has probably always been my favourite spot on the site, and it's a lovely viewpoint. There's a memorial bench here at Gore Point, and from this area you can see everything that's special about the North Norfolk coast. You can see all the different stages of, you know, growth of a very sort of dynamic system. If you come out a little bit further, I'm going to introduce you to some salt marshes. They're all different ages, and looking back towards the lighthouse at Old Hunstanton, we have Lavender Marsh. Okay, to the left of it you can just see the old seawall behind that. So that's Lavender Marsh. That's about 140 years old, quite old. There's less and less water getting into there, so it's in the process of very gradually drying out. Okay. Now in front of us, to the right, one of the fenced areas, we've got an area that we call Twite Marsh. So Twite is where that sandy patch is, just in the middle of the salt marsh there. We call that Twite Marsh, and that's because many years ago, 25 years ago, it used to be a frequent area where we saw twite, which is a small passerine which is found. It breeds in the Pennines and in Scotland, but it winters down here on the salt marshes, and we just gave it that name. So that's Twite Marsh, and sadly twite are very, very rare now, and we probably only get about half a dozen winter here every year now, and that's in Thornham Harbour. So that salt marsh is only 15 to 20 years old. Now, the fencing that we put up is there to protect the nesting birds, but what it also protects is the vegetation.
Yeah.
That's really crucial. And that's helped no end down towards the golf course, where the shingle ridges have been fenced. And we've always made sure we fence behind as well, because the ring plovers need to go, the chicks need to go out onto the mud to feed.
But I think that's quite stunning and interesting. And also, if the camera can pick up, not sure, but just over here above the sea Buckthorn, you can see the marram, and you can see how that is the yellow dune there, and you can see why it's called the yellow dune, because you can see the sand through the marram, and the marram is patchy and it's not 100% covering it, which is brilliant. That's dynamic, and that's growing. That's a growing dune that's going to be increasing in height, and with it being fenced off, you're enabling that to happen and not be impeded in a way when it's at the early stages. And you can also see towards the end, you can see that sort of darker green of the embryo dunes vegetation and the dune pioneers, where that's also fenced off, which is, as you say, it's that win-win situation where the birds have their habitats, but the dunes have theirs as well, in a way.
Yeah. I mean, this channel changes every 6 years.
Yeah.
So this will fill in with sand.
Yeah.
And it will build up, and then it'll need just a storm event or a storm tide or a really high tide event, and the shingle that's holding all the water back just completely goes. The pressure's too much, and it pushes through again. But the general trend here at the back of these salt marshes at Lavender Marsh is they are gradually drying
up.
But this is the beauty of these systems, left to their own devices for the beach.
Holme is a popular site for dog walkers, and mindful walkers and on-leash dogs are very welcome. However, it's incredibly important to be mindful of the negative impact any dog can have on these delicate ecosystems and their inhabitants.
Yeah, so going back to dogs, so they can certainly impact on nesting shorebirds. The trouble with high tides, this is a really big issue. With high tides, it covers the beach, obviously, the big springs, and what it does is it narrows the amount of beach that's available to people, to dogs, and to the wildlife, and particularly birds like ring plovers. They are really susceptible because oyster catchers are slightly different. They're a species that are fed by the parents, so they tend to stay up in the shingle, in the marram often, and are fed. But the ring plover has to usually feed on the strand line. The phrase we often hear heard is, my dog won't do this and it won't do that. Unfortunately,
It does.
dogs have natural impulses, and picking up something to eat
Yeah, so
is
even
one
if
of them.
even if the dog is on the control on the lead, you don't necessarily realise that it's done it by the time it's done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so actually that kind of reinforces the sticking to the path.
So for the
Yeah.
poor old ring plovers, they're protected by the fence. The nests are protected by the fence.
Yeah.
But as soon as the chicks have hatched, they want to be on the strand line. You know,
Yeah.
the strand line I showed you earlier. They want to be on that wet strand line of the last tide. And there's loads of invertebrates, flies and insects that are found there, and that's what they're feeding on. So this is why the ring plover is in such a poor old state, population-wise, from 350 pairs 30 years ago to less than 100 now on the coast.
One incredible feature of dunes is their ability to act as a sea defence. We mentioned early on in this podcast the storm surge of 2013 and its effects on the dunes and pine trees, but we neglected to talk about how dunes can act as a natural sea defence, and one that is in fact responsive and evolving to the surrounding environment.
So the sea defence isn't just the dunes, and when we talk about sea defence, it isn't just the seawall. It includes also the beach, and in actual fact, it covers up to 50 metres below out to sea, 50 metres below sea level. That is the whole transect for sea defence, and that's the whole system. So it's a lot of sediment and matter. So when there's a storm surge, it takes all of that into account to see if the coast is resilient. And dunes need areas to go backwards. When they get hit by a storm surge, actually they'll go up and they'll move the sand. It's like when you build a sandcastle with wet sand, it stays rigid. Well, you know, when you wet sand, it coagulates and it links together. So actually, not all of the sand dune is lost. Some of it has just moved and changed shapes and.
Yeah, the other thing with
buffers.
sand as well, it acts a bit like a sponge. So where you've got that natural system back there, you've got it's all about the profile. So you've got this shallow profile that leads up to the marram. The tides come in, and it literally buffers the action of the waves.
Yeah.
The issue we have just here, where we are here now, because it's an erosions part of the site.
Yeah.
You've got a steep cliff, and when you get the northeasters come in, all they have to do is gnaw away at the bottom, and they slump. They just go whoomp like that. And that's why those trees were dropping off the edge of the dunes.
And you can do this experiment at home in a box with water and sand. You just when you just like you just build a pile of sand and just throw water as if it's a wave to it, and you'll see what happens to the sand. And the sand stays in the system; it doesn't disappear, and it takes time to come back. And as Gary was saying, at the moment we're in what they call a collision profile, where it's gnawing away at it and it's undermining it. And this is particularly the case because this area has got pressures on both sides. So it's got the pine forest that's been planted and the freshwater marshes that are being protected by those trees to actually keep it fresh water and actually stabilise this. But actually there's nowhere for this dune to go backwards. And it needs to go backwards and have that salt marsh process to start the whole dynamics again to be able to then grow out. And that until that, I mean, in effect, this then creates a slight issue because the dune cannot really move anywhere. So apart from maybe planting lots of marram grass out the front and trying to artificially nourish the beach to grow it outwards and create a natural system, I mean, that would probably be the dream, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the thing is, obviously, it was a very 70s thing, planting marram.
Yeah.
But actually, you know, it's all about sediment, it's all about movement, and it's about profiles.
Yep.
And the amounts of water involved, the amounts of pressure on the front of the dune. So at Cly, okay, it's not really a dune system, but it's a natural defence system there. 25, 30 years ago, the shingle ridge at Cly was always bulldozed up to act as a defence. But we've now found, after we've allowed natural processes to take place, we've got a lovely flat profiled beach now, and it takes the energy out of the sea when it comes in. And
what you want is a long
very,
big
very
beach.
long profile
Beach, yeah. And the beach is the first line of defence, of course, if you were to use military terms.
And we're only really interested in this lately because of the increased summer sea storm surges and climate change.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
increased storminess, and climate change has caused the 1 in 100-year events that we'd call them to happen more frequently. And so, well, that, you know, dunes haven't had recently the time to regenerate over a longer period of time to then be prepared for the next storm surge.
So it's a new thing that we're going to have to learn about pretty quickly, aren't we?
Yeah.
But dunes
and-
have the ability, and this is why they're great as nature-based solutions for coastal protection and for protecting coastal areas, rather than seawall, because if you're talking about sea level rise and the sea's going to rise bit by bit, well, dunes have this capacity to potentially grow with it and actually be resilient to that if we manage them properly and we actually give them the space to do that. Whereas seawalls, you're not going to be adding 50 centimetres to a seawall every 10 years to match sea level rise. The cost of that to all our seawalls and dikes and across the coast is just, you know, not measurable really, actually, and it's not. I don't think we're ever going to do that. So using natural processes is really key. Yeah.
So Gary, you've been here 30 years.
Yeah.
When did you start worrying about sand dunes as your main form of protection?
Well, up to about 6 or 7 years ago, we were very worried because our only source of water was from a borehole. So one of the issues we always had was if the borehole becomes obviously filled with salt water, the issues we may have, you know, literally living on site, actually protecting the site from the middle of the site. Anyway, we now have mains water, so that threat's gone. But yeah, I mean, that these dunes have, as I said earlier about the 1970s overhead maps, we've lost nearly 25 metres of dune off.
Thank you for listening to the Norfolk Sand Dunes podcast. This podcast was recorded, produced and edited by Kim Hammond and Chris Bonfiglioli for the Open University Norfolk Living Dunes project. Special thanks for this podcast go to Mel Gillings and Sydney Jacus of Norfolk County Council, Professor George Revill of the Open University, and Gary Hibberd, Theo de Clermont, Nick Khandpur from Norfolk Wildlife Trust, Holme Parish Council and Councillor Jamieson for their support and participation. We hope you've enjoyed learning more about Norfolk's wonderful dunes. For more information, please head to www.endure.eu.com. And remember, please respect and protect your dunes and enjoy wildlife responsibly.